Welcome. It's nice to be back. This is John Arnold here, J. Arnold and Associates, and I've got my regular partner here, Chris Fine from Integrative Technologies, and we are going to continue our ongoing series of podcasts about what's happening in tech, particularly in communications technologies, and also really digital transformation and the digital workplace. A lot to talk about. And for this segment, we are going to talk actually about blockchain. How's that for a change of pace? I'm based in Toronto, and in early August, there was a conference here focused on this called the Blockchain Futurist Conference. And I think everyone's been curious about blockchain for a while now. And the kind of associated theme of this event, cryptocurrencies, which is really out there, but boy, everyone wants to be in on this thing right now. Feels like a bit of a gold rush, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So let me bring Chris into the call and just get connected here for our listeners. Hi, Chris.
Hi, John. It's nice to be back with you.
Yeah, same here. And we head into the early fall. You know, that's when things heat up again in our worlds, and blockchain is certainly a good way to start things off because I think it is going to be one of the trends du jour for the foreseeable future. So I certainly have a few thoughts. Why don't we just get going on that, and maybe you could just set the table for us today.
Great. Thanks, John. So this sounds like a very interesting conference, the Blockchain Futurist event that you went to in Toronto. And I was thinking we could start there, and maybe you could give us just your feeling about the vibe of the conference. What did you see? And, you know, this is an exciting technology everybody's very focused on. And, what was your sense of the content and the people that were at the conference?
Yeah, well, if you've been to any events around AI, there's certainly a similar feel for the hype, and yes, the excitement about what this space represents. There's no doubt that there's a gold rush mentality out there for people in the crypto space looking to cash in or cash out. That's a little scary. That's kind of a sidebar to this, but the feel there is a lot of anticipation that this is a technology, particularly the blockchain, that's starting to become real, looking for an ecosystem, looking for real business opportunities, and also ways to connect, of course, the traditional financial world to the emerging digital currency space, which is really more a question of when than if, but right now it's still a pretty rocky road to follow.
Well, John, one of the things that was intriguing to me is that this is a futurist conference, and so I would infer from that as opposed to just talking about the large opportunity of applications today, which we know there is, that some of the speakers might have spoken about more of the future and what all of this implies, this transformation to blockchain. So what was your feeling about that? What were some of the interesting future predictions for this?
Yeah, so there certainly were, and I'll touch on two different things. The best for last is really at the end of the time I was there, where Larry King, yes, of CNN fame and fortune, was kind of the big draw for the event, and he hosted a panel talking about what some of these people are seeing for the future. But before we get to that, I just want to go to the opening panel I saw, which was also about future of blockchain, and some very smart people up there talking, including our longtime associate and pal and visionary, Jeff Pulver, who has had more than a few toes in this space for a long time. And, we've been around the block on this stuff for a long time in the tech space, Chris, right? And Jeff never fails to say the right things. And the kind of vision that we've seen him bring to Voight, he was bringing a similar message there to this space. And it was really refreshing to hear because a lot of this audience doesn't know Jeff, but I think he speaks pretty sagely for what people need to think about in this space. So he's as excited about the potential as anybody, but he really had some, I think, good gravitas to looking at the bigger picture with this in terms of we know this stuff is coming, but at the same time we need to focus on how to use this technology for good applications and ways to make our lives better. He was one of the first to be talking about how, not so much focusing how to cash out of this opportunity financially, but to look at the good things it can do, not so much the not so good things. And what I mean by that is he wants to focus on living in the moment, making the world a better place. And the technologies here have the potential to make a lot of things more efficient, but also it kind of alienates people in a lot of ways, potentially by letting them be too dependent on the technology to do things for them and bring those efficiencies that we want. But at the same time, we spend so much time chasing the technology, we're neglecting the world around us and living in the moment. So he's looking for that balance of the human, the humanity that blockchain can in some way deliver, without becoming this cold, alienating technology. And so he's kind of bringing a bit of that outsider's perspective to the people here who are really trying to, duke it out to establish some dominance in this space and longevity.
So did you feel that some of the rest of it was more technocratic futures? Because Jeff always does bring a human element to things. But was it more like this, I don't want to say sci-fi, but more the vision, the technical vision a little further out?
Yeah, there was a lot of that, Chris. I mean, a lot of the speakers, there were keynotes and there were panels, and of course all the chit-chat for the tabletops outside. A lot of it was the plumbing. Security, converting, doing transactions between digital currencies and real currencies, or just digital to digital currencies. So a lot of people were talking about stuff that really is way over my head in terms of being day-to-day relevance, because I'm looking for communications applications. But that plumbing certainly has to be there, and it reminds me of the early days of VoIP, where people were talking about all the building blocks of IP networks, which, has to be there. So that was kind of interesting to see, that they're still kind of at that stage where, the pieces have to be kind of put in place and people have to understand the basic technologies before it can translate into the kind of benefits that businesses are looking for.
Interesting. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the VoIP reference that you made, or the comparable that you feel. But I wanted to just ask you briefly about the Larry King panel before we get to that, because that's certainly an intriguing intro that you made there.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, he definitely was the reason that people stuck around to the end. And as a sidebar, we've done many, many conferences over the years. And he was, unfortunately, he may have been the lock note, but he wasn't the last speaker of the day. And I sure feel bad for the guy who had to go on after him.
Oh boy.
When Larry was done, I mean, people were heading out to the bar. So, that's the way it goes. Anyways, Larry was, of course, he was there actually because he's in this space. Interestingly, he is an advisor to one of the companies called Gear. And what Gear does is there's actually a green element to the blockchain space, and it's all about crypto mining. Which is an activity that takes up a lot of horsepower, a lot of energy. And so the name of the game in this space, and it literally is the gold rush thing, that there's a lot of activity and money being spent to set up crypto mining operations. And that's involves having access to cheap power and a lot of computer power. And this company is really focused on finding more green, eco-friendly ways to do this crypto mining. And Larry King is a big advocate of sustainability and environmental causes. So that's the common ground that got him as an advisor to these guys. But he was speaking on this panel more as the, third party looking at the industry and talking about the future. So he's coming there saying, listen, I'm an old guy. He said that his opening line was, I'll bet I'm the oldest guy in the room, and I'm pretty sure he was right. But he was there to really say, okay, I don't know much about what blockchain and crypto is really about, so you guys tell me, and I'll ask the questions to keep it going. So he kind of, there's no harm in asking the dumb questions, because the marketplace needs to be educated. And he did a great job of pulling out some ideas from the speakers. But the best idea that he had was, he asked one telling question, which was, what would Steve Jobs make of blockchain? And that was the question. Yeah, right. And that was the question that really got everyone's attention, because for the first time in that conference, they talked about making it real. And the consensus was that Apple would have probably seen this as a great opportunity for them, because it really is kind of ties into, having more secure communications and taking a lot of inefficiencies out of transactions and all kinds of things. But it was really interesting that they talked about how right now blockchain is a very kind of cold and sterile technology. It just seems so unhuman. And what Apple has been so good at, of course, is humanizing technology, creating great experiences that really make it part of your life. And so the takeaway for me was, what I wanted to see is, if this industry has a Steve Jobs, I think its odds of success will be faster and much better than trying to, where it is today, which is it's very much a techie thing, much like VoIP was in the early days, right? And eventually it matures and those visionaries come out. And that's why I want to point back to Jeff, because he was a visionary for VoIP, much like Steve Jobs was for commercializing a lot of those personal technologies that we take for granted now. The person I'm looking for to make blockchain, really mainstream and relevant to the masses.
Well, I wonder if it's a Steve Jobs or a Bill Gates or whoever else that we might name that turns out to be the comparable. I have one more question. I want to be sensitive to time, John.
Yeah.
But in terms of the VoIP early days, potentially large industry that can be disrupted, kind of comparable, who do you think, if anybody, is today's equivalent of what the large carriers, the service providers were in the days of VoIP? And this was a transformative technology that went up against a very entrenched industry at the time. Do you think that there's the same kind of obstacle for blockchain, or do you think today it's much more fluid?
Well, I think, the same obstacles, here would be, of course, big banks and the whole highly regulated financial sector, which is as you've come from and know very well, is a very kind of tightly knit, I wouldn't say a boys club, but certainly an oligarchy of companies that really drive, our economy. And for them, much like with the telcos back then, there's a threat and an opportunity to what blockchain and crypto represent, because the efficiencies it can bring to financial transactions is obvious. And so I think there's a real benefit there. But as soon as you start to pose a challenge to the status quo of traditional fiat currency, et cetera, digital currencies, as we know, don't have any formal asset backing like we understand. And that's a very disruptive model. So there's a lot of concern there. And obviously they're going to fight this all they can, or make sure that it's regulated in ways that keep them in the game.
Well, let's see what happens. My view on that's a little bit different. I think that they're all circling around blockchain and experimenting every way that they can, much more than the carriers did at the time. So we'll see. I mean, I don't know if they've seen the big plunge they can take yet, but I feel as though the minute that they do, that they're actually going to plunge right in.
Yeah, I would agree with that too, because this is not one they're going to want to let get away. It's just the stakes are too high.
Right, and it also can address some of their major problems, potentially, like security, compliance, record keeping. So there's lots of interesting business cases to get involved when it matures to the point. But let's stay tuned and see what happens. But thanks for the conference recap. That's super interesting. Sounds like a great event.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks. Thanks, Chris. So with that, let's tune out for this one. And we'll thank everybody, Chris and I, for listening. And we'll be back with another podcast soon. Thanks again, all.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone.